So thank you for joining us today. My name is Dee Zink, and I'm with the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. And I'm fortunate to be able to host this monthly gathering and dialogue with actually my co-host of this monthly gathering with Connor Everts, who is the Executive Director of the Southern California Watershed Alliance. Connor may be able to join us, but mostly in listening mode because he's off on a well-deserved vacation right now. So I will be your host today, and I'm just delighted to be able to be here to bring this program to you. So we have a few different items. Oh, and I should go ahead and acknowledge that all of the programs that are put together for the Southern California Water Dialogue are done so with a committee that helps make sure that we have interesting and pertinent topics of the day. And so I'd like to thank the steering committee members who are listed on this screen for their efforts behind the scenes to make sure we're always bringing you great programming. So with that, I'd like to just go through our ground rules for our webinar. We handle our, we like to have a dialogue, but the virtual nature of the way we handle our program now is that it's best for us to go through the presentations and then to have our Q&A at the end. So we have a couple of different ways to make sure we're engaging, but first want to make sure that you know that we do not use the chat for questions. We definitely put our questions in the Q&A area. If you have an issue, though, some sort of technical problem, you're not hearing something, go ahead and use the chat for that. And then there's a great team behind the scenes that's trying to help us ensure that we're providing good programming. There's a couple of tips on the machine, on the screen to make sure that if you're having difficulty, you have a good session with us today. And so about our session, we generally have our presentations for about an hour. And then the last half an hour is devoted to our Q&A. And our last few programs, we actually have had difficulty getting through all the Q&A. So really appreciate the engagement of the community. Okay, as far as how to ask a question, at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. And then when you click on that button, please type in your question. I'll be asking the questions and allowing for both of our presenters to respond. If you like a question, there's a way to give it a thumbs up, and that brings that question up to the top of the list. So if we do have a lot of questions at the end, then you'll have an opportunity to prioritize the questions that you really would like. So hope you will take advantage of that. All right, we've already had our announcements for the day, so we're going to go ahead and move forward with the presentations. And it is my pleasure to talk about our program today for a minute about bringing groundwater basins back into balance. Obviously, water is a precious resource, so we all know that, and groundwater has been, we have had challenges in many areas of the state with groundwater basins and making sure that they are replenished. The Southern California Water Dialogue is interested in not just Southern California issues, but statewide and Western issues as well. And so we're really pleased to have two premier speakers joining us today who are very knowledgeable on groundwater issues and also really focused on some of the solutions that, that we can adopt and to aid those that are working on groundwater basins. Our first speaker, who will get into some of the issues related to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act from a seat of great knowledge and involvement at the Public Policy Institute of California, will be Ellen Hannock. Ellen, I'm going to go ahead and give a little bit of biographical information on both of our speakers, and then we'll get into the presentations. So I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with Ellen Hannock, but she's the Vice President and Director of the Water Policy Center and Senior Fellow. She also holds the Ellen Hannock Chair in Water Policy at the Public Policy Institute of California. How nice to have a chair named after you. That's pretty snazzy. Under her leadership, the center has become a critical source of information and guidance for natural resource management in California. And as many of you know, she's authored dozens of reports and articles and even books on water policy. Her research is often profiled in the media nationally and around the world. And she is focused on a number of different areas, including climate change and infrastructure finance. And so we're really pleased to have her join us today. And I'll let her give a little more of her background when she speaks. I also want to introduce Ann Hayden, who is the Associate Vice President of the Environmental Defense Fund's Climate Resilient Water Systems Program, where she oversees the implementation of sustainable water management approaches in the arid US, including California and the Colorado River Basin. And focuses on advancing incentive-based approaches that ensure adequate water for ecosystems and agricultural resilience to climate change, and being able to specifically address the needs of disadvantaged communities. So there's an intersection there that I think we're going to hear about today. For more than 2 decades, Ann has built broad coalitions to advance pragmatic solutions that benefit both people and the environment. And she's an expert on the development and implementation of well-designed markets that strike the right balance between ecosystem protection and the prosperity of communities. So in addition, Ann is board chair of the San Francisco Estuary Institute and is active in several other organizations, and you may be intersecting with Ann in those ways too. So we're really pleased to have both of you here to join us today on our program. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and hand over the program to Ellen Hannock. Welcome, Ellen.
Thank you very much, Dee, and thanks to everybody on the organizing team for the invitation. It's great to visit with you all in the SoCal Water Dialogue community. It's been a while since I've been a speaker here, and I think the last time I did it was before the Zoom era, so down at the Met offices. So I miss seeing your faces, but this made the travel time easier. I will say that much.
All right, well, take it away.
Thanks. So, the Public Policy Institute of California is a nonpartisan research organization, and we really in the Water Center try to do work that looks for kind of pragmatic, cooperative solutions to some of our big water and natural resource challenges. And getting our groundwater basins into balance is definitely one of those big challenges. So we've been doing a lot of work on sort of implementation of the law affectionately known for short as SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And what I'm going to do today is give you a little bit of a status check on SGMA implementation, a little bit of an overview of what SGMA is, and then kind of drill down into some detailed analysis and about the experience in the San Joaquin Valley, which as you'll see in a minute is kind of ground zero for implementation of this law. But then we'll also kind of wrap up with some of the implications for elsewhere in California and the West. So next slide. So this is just big picture overview, a map to start with of California's main groundwater basins. We are a state that is fortunate to have a lot of groundwater basins that are kind of living, breathing basins that can be actively managed and actively recharged. And in Southern California, where many of you are, there's been active management of the groundwater basins for quite some time. That came about because people got too thirsty with the basins, and there were problems of overdraft where pumping kind of was exceeding the replenishment over the long term, and with all kinds of consequences, including groundwater levels falling, land sinking, saltwater intrusion, and what have you. So that led to adjudications of basins and also the creation of some special management districts like the Orange County Water District or Coachella Valley Water District that have special authorities to manage the basins. And you can see basins like that are in green on my map. There are some also up on the Central Coast. They're not quite as big, so they may not pop for you as much. But what we also had was a lot of basins that were not being actively managed in that way, and where overdraft was really continuing on a long-term basis, and especially in some agricultural areas, especially on the Central Coast, where there's a lot of very high value agriculture, fruits and vegetables, and then also in the San Joaquin Valley, which is the big orange swath in the middle of the state that you see there. So those orange basins are the ones that are considered critically overdrafted by the state, and the ones in yellow are other basins that also are subject to SGMA that also need to comply with the law. And what the law requires is kind of a uniquely California thing. We were the last Western state to have a statewide law about managing groundwater in a comprehensive way, but it's done in a way that's a little bit unusual. Only a few other states have a very strong local responsibility for that oversight. So in California's case, local responsibility, the law required the creation of groundwater sustainability agencies to basically manage, develop plans and manage, implement them to get to sustainability. And that was for about 85 priority basins. Some of them are quite big and some of them are tiny. And the law required, first forming these sustainability agencies, and you can only be in one. So each groundwater user in one of these basins is in one groundwater sustainability agency's jurisdiction. There could be multiple GSAs within basins, and that definitely happens in larger basins. The planning deadlines for filling out a whole lot of planning requirements were January 2020 for the critically overdrafted basins, those ones that are in bright orange on the map, and then January 2022 for the other basins. And the law also requires annual reporting of a lot of data and updates of the plans every 5 years. And you've got to get to sustainability by the early 2040s, basically 20 years after you submit your first groundwater sustainability plan, which is a long time, but it's also a big job. And so I think there was recognition that it was going to take some time for folks to get all of this in place and not to just have a big sort of shock to the system. So flexible timeline, but with guardrails. And those guardrails are that you have to, as a groundwater sustainability agency, be managing, your plan has to be managing to avoid what the law calls significantly unreasonable, undesirable effects. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but things that are basically that bad things that can happen from groundwater mismanagement or lack of groundwater management, like wells going dry and land sinking. So next slide, please. And this is why we have been doing a lot of work in the San Joaquin Valley. It's really ground zero for implementation of SGMA. I've kind of outlined it there, the same map that I just showed you, only now you see the outlines of the two hydrologic regions that include the San Joaquin Valley. And most of it is in bright orange. And just in terms of surface area, you can see there's some other orange swaths. There's some other critically overdrafted basins on the Central Coast, in SoCal a little bit, but in terms of land area and the number of basins that are critically overdrafted, this is by far the biggest. This is also California's largest ag region, over half of the crop output and major home of dairy and beef in the state. It's got the biggest groundwater imbalance. We estimate about 2 million acre feet a year net of net overdraft. Lot of consequences, and this became really apparent in the drought of 2012 to 2016, in the midst of which SGMA was passed. You saw a lot of wells going dry, drinking wells going dry, land sinking. That's been going on for 100 years, but it got really acute again. And then just a concern about future supplies if groundwater supplies disappear, are depleted through pumping. So because this region has the biggest problems, it also had the tightest timelines. Most of the plans were due in January 2020. And the big picture story in terms of the solution here, or what I sort of sometimes call the groundwater math problem, is that you can get to balance by adding more supply, using less water, or what we sometimes call managing demand, or some combination. And our analysis points to the need really to do both, and that We think maybe you can deal with about a quarter of the deficit with cost-effective new supplies, and probably the rest has to be with demand management. And the economics problem with all of this is that some of the approaches and solutions are more costly than others, and that's why some supplies might be feasible technically, but not cost-effective. Like, ocean desal is not going to work for supplying agriculture in the San Joaquin Valley, even if it's technically feasible to do it. And there are also, as you'll see, different ways to manage demand, and some of those are more costly than others. Next slide. So, there's good news and there's bad news in the status check on this. The good news is that in general, both in the Valley and across California, basins water users in the basins have met the early stage SGMA requirements. They formed their GSAs on time. They, by and large, got their plans in on time. And that's required a lot of work, in some cases, really starting from almost scratch in terms of the kinds of data they had to pull together. And a lot of those plans are not bad at all, are pretty good at kind of meeting all the requirements. But in the Valley, it's been a struggle on that score. So what happens when you submit the plans? They go to the Department of Water Resources, which then has that's sort of the first state responsibility, is to review those plans. And DWR sent all of the critically overdrafted basin plans in the San Joaquin Valley back for more homework after their review. And the folks in the basins had 6 months to do that homework, resubmit the plans. And now DWR has rejected 6 of those plans. I think it's 6. Yes, six of those plans. You can see the ones that are in orange on the right-hand map in front of you, and it's provisionally accepted most of the others. A few of them are still under review. So what it means, what happens when your plan is rejected or deemed inadequate, I think is the technical term, is that then it goes over to the State Water Resources Control Board, which has the authority to put the basin on probation and to basically take over management until the locals are able to meet what the state deems an acceptable level of addressing the issues. So there are probationary hearings that are going to be scheduled starting in December of this year for those basins that are in orange there. So let's go to the next slide. So just a little context on why the plans were rejected or deemed inadequate and what plans have to do. So SGMA requires sustainable long-term management, and it was really enacted not just to solve some groundwater math problem for the sake of solving a math problem, but really to avoid significant undesirable results. And these are the 6 categories of deadly sins, sometimes they're called, the 6 commandments. You cannot cause significant and unreasonable results by lowering groundwater levels, and you think about that especially as causing people's wells to go dry. There's a special concern about drinking water wells in places, many parts of the San Joaquin Valley and elsewhere in the state, where you've got a lot of folks on shallow domestic wells or small community systems that are on wells that aren't very deep. Reducing storage, so that's kind of reducing water available for the long term. Land subsidence, which is a big concern in parts of the San Joaquin. Seawater intrusion, not a problem in the San Joaquin, but a big issue along coastal aquifers. That's why Orange County Water District was created, or a major reason why it was created. Surface water depletion is another one, because groundwater and surface water interact in a lot of places. And so groundwater pumping can deplete rivers and streams. It can also deplete wetlands and damage groundwater dependent ecosystems. And then groundwater management can degrade water quality. And let's go to the next slide. So in the San Joaquin, the 2 big issues that were flagged by DWR in their reviews of these undesirable results were regarding lowering of groundwater levels and deeming that there was inadequate attention to, in particular, the impacts that this would have on that the plans would have on domestic well levels and on wells going dry, and then also land subsidence, that the plans did not adequately deal with that. And we can go to the next slide. And this was especially, kind of reflected in, and DWR also commented on this issue, that the plans were extremely optimistic in our view, some analysis that we did on how much of the gap they could meet by adding more water. And everybody wants to avoid land fallowing, because basically in an agricultural area, most of the water savings that you're going to get are going to be from taking land out of production. This is not something you can solve with irrigation efficiency. It's only really by reducing the net amount of water that crops are consuming. And so it requires, some crop shifting can get you there, but mainly land fallowing. And the plans in the Valley did not put a lot of emphasis on that. They did put some emphasis on that yellow part there in my chart of moving water around, shifting surface water, but they didn't really do the math of where that water was coming from means that it was going to reduce water available to somebody else. And then they put a lot of emphasis on groundwater recharge. That's my green bucket there. And that's a very important thing to do in the Valley, capturing more flows from big storms. But that's probably an overly optimistic number. And it was clear when you kind of look at all the plans together that folks were counting on the same drops of water to solve problems in different basins. So this was also something that DWR flagged. So let's go to the next slide. So I guess, a question to ask, what could be asked is why didn't the plans do better on these things? And I would say that it was a big challenge that folks had to meet in the basin. This required coordinating in some completely new ways to manage something that people up till now had, individual growers have been managing on their own without having to coordinate unless they felt like it for a project like a recharge project or something. And the potential hit to this very agricultural economy was really large. So we, in some recent work, have kind of done some updated analysis looking at the potential decline of water supplies on average by 2040, taking into account sigma, plus some additional losses that might come from the changing climate, some climate model predictions, as well as from environmental flow, some new environmental flows that the State Water Board has proposed. You're looking at up to 20% decline in annual water supplies, almost as much in terms of irrigated acreage. So up to about 900,000 acres of irrigated cropland that would be fallowed, 50,000 jobs lost, and about a 2.3% decline in total regional GDP from this activity, from this reduced activity because of less water. So it's a big concern, and folks would rather find ways to augment supplies rather than manage demands. But there's a growing recognition that demand management is going to have to be part of the story. And so what we've been looking at, and others, and Anne is going to talk more about some of the work that they and others have been doing on this too, is looking at ways to soften this transition, because it's clear that getting to sustainability is going to be key for the long-term future of the region, but getting there and kind of softening the transition is going to also be important. So what we're looking at as some of the key tools are improved water trading rules, improved water infrastructure and recharge, ag productivity increases are going to help. And then key is also going to be finding productive uses for fallowed lands. So let's move to the next slide. This is just to give you an idea of kind of why the supply and demand management tools are going to be really important. So this just shows you declines in water availability that there will be with the different hits that the Valley is going to be taking from sigma. That's the first bar. Adding in some climate change, additional climate change impacts and environmental flows. That's the third bar. That gets you to more than 3 million acre feet of water that growers won't be able to apply to their fields in order to get the kind of water savings that are needed to keep basins in balance. And the ag GDP hit, and that's including crop production, dairy and beef, and food and beverage processing, could be, you know, quite significant. That's what you see in the second set of charts. So let's go to the next slide. I'll just say that the job losses kind of mirror the trends that I'm showing you in ag GDP losses. So it's money, but it's also it's people. So what this now shows you, we've added 4 bars here showing you how water trading could significantly cushion the costs of reducing water supplies. So what you see on the chart on the left, the reductions in applied water, that stays the same. So we're not changing the amount of water at this point. What we're doing is we're just allowing folks to move it around so that it goes to the crops that are most economically productive. That's where growers would want to buy the water to use it on their lands. And there would be some growers with crops that are less economically productive that would be willing to sell it in a sort of willing buyer, willing seller world. And what you can see there, you've got an orange bar, a yellow bar, and a green bar. Those are different levels of water trading, going from that brown, which is really inflexible management, sort of no trading and no flexibility. Everybody gets the same cuts within an area. Go to local trading, that's very local flexibility. Basin trading, the yellow, that's allowing trading within the whole groundwater basin. And then the green is valley trading, where you would also allow more surface water trading across basins. Groundwater would stay within its basin, but surface water would move around. So let's go to the next one. And then the last couple of few bars here just show you the additional economic value of also adding in new water. So we've looked at a couple scenarios for adding in new water. And then the last one is also with sort of adding in productivity growth. So, you know, there's a good news story, which is that there's a lot of innovative potential. And so folks will be innovating for sure, and figuring out how to cope with shortages and the changing climate. We didn't want to project too much on that, but that just gives you a sign that things will be changing, probably even with less water in a good way. So let's go to the next slide. And just why trading, how trading works. The chart on the map on the left shows you in different shades of color, sort of where there's a high fouling risk if you have inflexible water management with just proportional cuts across the board in areas that have the most deficit. And those bright red ones are the places where you'd have a high risk with more than 25% of the land being fallowed. The gray are areas that are good right now and that would probably have no risk. And with the other colors kind of in between. If you allow basin trading, you can see how in the middle there, it just sort of distributes the risk quite a bit. And basically the water wants to move to perennial crops. It wants to move from alfalfa and field crops like grains to perennials. Excuse me. And then with valley-wide trading, it wants to move out of some surface water wants to move out of some basins where folks can't grow perennials because of the conditions not being suitable, and it goes to the places where folks there's land that would really like to have that water. So let's go to the next slide now. So we've been looking at kind of what are opportunities for doing other productive things on these lands that are going to come out of production, whether whatever scenario of trading happens. We know there's going to be land that's going to be coming out of production. Want to look at economic opportunities for these lands, as well as opportunities for the ecosystems, and crucially opportunities for reducing dust risk, which is a real important public health concern. So I'm just walking you through really quickly a few of those options. And these are relevant for what Anne's going to be talking with you about later in terms of looking for multiple benefits potentially on lands coming out of your intense irrigation. So the map on the left is just to highlight that there's a lot of land that's got a lot of sun in this region, and it would be a really sweet place to put a lot of solar, utility scale solar, which would be a way to bring in revenues. It could also be good on the job front, certainly better than fallowed land on the job front. It could help meet California's clean energy goals. There are some challenges in getting enough transmission into place, but it could be really a win-win for the valley. And there's already a lot of active interest in this, and plenty of land where you could do this. The map on the right shows you just one slice of sort of habitat suitability. There's a lot of really high value opportunities for habitat restoration in places, some places that might have land fallowing. This is just showing you for San Joaquin Desert species, based on some work by the Nature Conservancy. In a county like, in a basin like Kern, there's way more suitable habitat than there is projected fallowing. Let's go to the next slide. Another thing that we've looked at is the potential for dryland farming or dryland farm, winter crops, rain-fed farming with spiking it with a little bit of irrigation just to kind of help with crop establishment. And what we find, you see, the more green you see here, the better the outcomes are. And this was looking at winter wheat as a forage crop, recognizing that there's going to likely be some real demand for increased sources of forage as alfalfa and irrigated pasture are likely to decline. Those take a lot of water, and they're likely just not to be prioritized as much by growers for that reason. So a lot of potential with that as an opportunity to kind of manage these lands better. Next slide. Big picture, just to kind of wrap, is that SGMA is key for the future, but it's going to shrink our irrigated agricultural footprint. Reducing water supplies in this way is going to call for both supply and demand side adaptations. There's been a lot of innovation on the supply side this year. With this wet year, we're seeing a lot of new kinds of recharge, which is great, but we're also starting to see some demand management experiments happening with allocations in some basins beginning of some groundwater trading, which is great. Careful management can soften the blow. Flexible water use, trading, investments in infrastructure and productivity, and incentives crucially to productively repurpose the ag lands. And I just have one more slide, and I'm going to hand it over to Anne. And this is just to acknowledge that, you know, what the valley is experiencing now, and we're also seeing some in some of the Central Coast basins. We're going to see these are looming issues across the West. And especially in the Colorado Basin, as folks have to respond to dwindling Colorado River supplies. And California is not going to be able to stay out of that one, even though we have the largest share of water and the most senior rights. Our urban and our ag communities are going to have to adapt, as will partners in other Western states. And so some of these solutions in terms of innovation and management on the supply and demand side are going to be really key there too. And with that, I'm going to thank you and hand it over to Anne, who's a dear colleague, and I'm excited to hear what she has to say.
Very nice segue, Ellen. Thank you again for the invitation to be here today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion that follows. And I'm really looking forward to providing an overview of this kind of somewhat new state program, the Multi-Benefit Land Repurposing Program, and how it can help create more resilience for the Central Valley's economy, for communities, for ecosystems. And to Ellen's last point, how this approach around land repurposing can be applied more broadly across the state, outside of the SGMA context, and in other places across the West where they are experiencing agricultural water scarcity and this need to build water and land resilience. So next slide. So before I dive into it, I want to give a brief overview for those of you who are less familiar with Environmental Defense Fund. We are a global environmental organization that's been around for over the last 50 years, addressing some of the world's greatest environmental challenges. And we do that by working collaboratively to develop solutions that bring together science and economics and partnerships, climate justice, and political advocacy. Next slide. And we work on a whole range of issues, from sustainable agriculture to clean energy to sustainable fishing. And I help lead our climate resilient water systems program. Next slide. So this map gives you a sense of the geographic scope of EDF's water program. We have a big focus on the arid West, where irrigated agriculture is the primary water use and where water scarcity is increasingly a pressing issue. And we are also starting to expand globally into Mexico and India. And our goal across all of these geographies is to develop replicable tools and approaches that we can test on the ground in one geography and then tailor it and apply it to other places that are experiencing similar challenges. Next slide. And EDF's approach to our work is really focused on co-designing solutions, most often directly with rural communities and agricultural partners. We have a big focus on developing multi-benefit solutions, and the MLRP program is a perfect example. This is, you know, the way in which we can really build political support for approaches to build water and land resilience is to make sure that there's not just a single beneficiary of these approaches, but that we're really spreading the benefits across sectors. We also have a lot of expertise in improving the reliability and accessibility of good water data and accounting, which is essential to improving water management. We're involved in developing an open source groundwater accounting platform, which we're hoping to make available to groundwater sustainability agencies across the state by the end of the year. And that's a partnership that we are working on with the Water Data Consortium and DWR and the state board. You may also have heard of a project called OpenET, which is focused on creating a platform to make information about evapotranspiration easily available at no or low cost, again, with the intention of helping to improve water management. We also have a significant focus on working to engage and equip communities throughout the Valley with the tools and information and resources to be effective decision makers in processes such as SGMA. And this is a program known as the Water Leadership Institute. And then finally, we provide guidance on various strategies to water management where we have particular expertise and where there is a gap in good guidance. And some examples include how to design healthy or well-designed water trading programs, how to manage interconnected surface water, which is a big challenge as SGMA is being implemented, and how to develop wildlife-friendly recharge basins. Okay, next slide. So Ellen already kind of painted the picture already, so I won't go into a ton of detail here, just to underscore that this issue around the implementation of SGMA and just this looming issue of water scarcity writ large is going to have a significant impact on our agricultural sector. The San Joaquin Valley is ground zero, as Ellen referenced, for these changes. The estimate, according to PPIC, is upwards of 750,000 acres to over 1 million acres may have to go out of production over the next 2 decades as SGMA is implemented. And the impact to the social fabric, the economy, the environment, the air quality of the valley could be significant. And what I'm showing here on the right is a scenario of what kind of this haphazard land retirement could look like without proactive management. The fallowed fields are shown here as kind of the brown speckles. Next slide. So, to the point that we already just touched on when we heard Ellen, if unmanaged, fallowed fields could have a massive impact on creating basically a dust bowl in the valley. It could worsen already impaired air quality. These fallowed fields could host weeds and pests and really impact the remaining agricultural lands. And low impact and marginalized communities will likely be most affected by these impacts. And, you know, as I mentioned, the cultural fabric of the valley, which is so much tied to agriculture, would be significantly impacted as well. But there is an alternative to just leaving fields idled, and that is land repurposing. Next slide. So multi-benefit land repurposing is basically the practice of transitioning previously irrigated agricultural land to new uses that will, you know, conserve water and deliver a range of benefits to communities and ecosystems. And the idea is here to reduce groundwater reliance and create local environmental and economic opportunities through these land use changes. So here are a number of examples. This is not a complete list. I think there's an opportunity for a lot of creativity and innovation on this issue. But here are some known examples that folks are thinking a lot about now. So there's managed grazing, whether it's cattle or sheep. There's renewable energy through low impact solar. There's the potential for dry land crops, which PPIC has done a lot of thinking about. There's, you know, the potential for developing recreational spaces for communities. There's a real desert, literally, in the valley when it comes to spaces for communities to gather and recreate. And then there's the potential for multi-benefit groundwater recharge basins. And this is, you know, the case in which, you know, years like we've just had now, where we can opportunistically direct flood flows to recharge basins, store that water underground so that we have that there in dry years, and to design these recharge basins in ways that can create habitat for migratory birds, can reduce flood risk to downstream communities, and if carefully sited, could actually improve water quality of drinking water wells. And then finally, there's the potential for restoring habitat. We have really just islands of existing protected areas in the valley. There's a huge need to create more connectivity between these areas of habitat and expand the potential for species to be able to adapt again to the changing climate that we're expecting in the future. The goal across all of these options, at least from EDF's point of view, is to really help farmers, to the extent possible, maintain cultivated fields where possible, while also creating opportunities to repurpose fields and thereby reduce the economic impacts of this transition. Next slide. So this is, you know, a highly simplified example of how this could work. So on the left is this kind of business as usual. This is what this haphazard land fallowing could look like, this patchwork of fallowed fields interspersed among agricultural fields. And then on the right is an example of strategically working with farmers who would voluntarily repurpose some of their land that they no longer have water to irrigate, and repurpose it to create habitat and habitat connectivity adjacent to existing areas of habitat, which is the dark green area shown on this map. This is one type of repurposing. EDF is you know, a believer that there's the potential to really create a whole mosaic of new uses across the valley. This should not just be about repurposing it to one new use, but a whole variety of uses depending on what communities want to see, what stakeholders want to see, what is going to be most beneficial for the economy, public health, et cetera. Next slide. So to get out ahead of this looming land use change, about, I would say, 5 or 6 years ago, EDF really started leaning in on this particular issue about how to, you know, kind of design a new program that could support farmers and rural communities through this transition. and help create new value on land using less water. So a few years ago, we started working with legislators in the Valley and sponsored a bill to establish the multi-benefit land repurposing program. Along the way, we worked with all of these entities shown here to help design the framework for the program that could be broadly supported. So as you'll see here, there are NGOs and land trust and community-based organizations and agricultural entities, water agencies. Ultimately, in 2021, the governor approved $50 million to establish the multi-benefit land repurposing program at the Department of Conservation to provide funding for landowners on a voluntary basis who can demonstrate a reduction in groundwater use and repurpose their lands to new uses that can create public benefits. And I'll go into more detail on the structure of the program in a minute. One thing I want to underscore throughout all of this that EDF was really focused on, because we heard it loud and clear from landowners in the Valley, is they needed flexibility in how this transition happens. Not every landowner is going to want to sign up to put an easement on their land and perpetually have habitat on these repurposed lands. Some may, but there are going to be plenty others who are going to be interested in a shorter term commitment where they can experiment with some of these new uses. And so the program very intentionally allows the option of a minimum of 10 years of lands being repurposed all the way to permanent land repurposing. Next slide. So I'll just touch on the goals of the MLRP. But before I do that, I do want to underscore that this is really a program, a companion program to the implementation of SGMA. SGMA is determining how folks are going to be ramping down their groundwater use and how allocations are going to be made to landowners. This program is here to help landowners have options about how they manage the land that they have with the water that they have. And so some of the goals are to support coordinated regional and basin scale efforts towards groundwater sustainability, to support long-term repurposing of lands and convert land to less intensive water use, to create and restore wildlife habitat and wildlife connectivity, supporting nature-based solutions that will reduce impacts of hazards on property and the economy from overdrafted groundwater basins, and then also to prioritize the delivery and achievement of benefits to disadvantaged communities. Next slide. So some of the key features, the program, and this actually should be updated, it delivers block grants of up to, now it's been changed to 9 million so that they can make the existing funding go a little bit further. 2 local entities, and I'll describe those in a minute, who's eligible. It requires clear demonstration of partnerships to show that there is stakeholder engagement, local involvement. There is funding available for tribes to be engaged in this program. There is the establishment of a new statewide support entity to help with implementation, and I'll describe that in a minute. It requires inclusive and coordinated planning, clear stakeholder engagement. There are a number of indicators of how that needs to show up, and I can go into that in more detail as well. The eligible costs that this program can cover include education, outreach, engagement, planning, and project development implementation. And there's also within that the opportunity for the local entity who received the block grant to have some discretion to use some of the funding for additional incentive payments. If there's really important lands that they want to bring into this program, that they have that ability to provide additional incentive payments on top of just covering the costs of implementing projects. And again, the program allows for both temporary to permanent projects. Next slide. So the structure of the program, this program is housed at the Department of Conservation. They need to implement it in consultation with other state agencies who are involved in SIGMA implementation, who kind of touch the program or its stakeholders directly, like California Department of Food and Ag, the Department of Water Resources, and the state board. Local entities can apply for these block grants, and local entities include groundwater sustainability agencies, resource conservation districts, tribes, public agencies, local NGOs, land trusts. They are then tasked with developing a multi-benefit agricultural land repurposing plan. And then funding can be developed or delivered to implement land repurposing projects on the ground, to help facilitate outreach and education, to help cover the costs of permitting and monitoring. As I said, there is some funding set aside for tribes to also directly tap into this program. And there's the establishment of this new statewide support entity, which I will describe next on the next slide. So importantly, this is a new entity the Department of Conservation created to, again, help them with implementation of this program. Environmental Defense Fund is co-chairing the statewide support entity with Self-Help Enterprises, which is a local community-based organization in the Valley. And, you know, I kind of see our role as really creating a hub of the best available information on a whole suite of land repurposing strategies, and to be a direct resource for the block grantees. We are also tasked with helping to shape community engagement for these block grants, working to, you know, help them ensure that they're bringing in voices from disadvantaged communities and socially disadvantaged farming and ranching individuals. And this is a role that Self-Help Enterprises is really leading on. We are also helping to facilitate kind of peer-to-peer learning and to create a community of practice among the block grant recipients. We are also tasked with developing the monitoring and reporting. How will the outcomes of the MLRP be measured and tracked over time? And then we're also tasked with developing the marketing and communications around this program. How do we, you know, elevate the success stories, lessons learned, to make this program much more real for folks who are interested in possibly engaging in it, and to really share lessons among stakeholders. Next slide. Just quickly touch on this timeline again, that in fall of 2021 is when the MLRP program was established with an initial 50 million. And this should say winter of 2021. That's when the Department of Conservation released its program guidelines that included a lot of stakeholder input. DOC has been fantastic in setting up this program and getting it off and running. In spring of 2022, 12 regions applied for MLRP program, MLRP funding. The requests far exceeded what was available. I think it was 112 million in requests for the 50 million that could be awarded. 4 regions were selected. We were then selected as the statewide support entity with Self-Help. In the fall of 2022, the state allocated an additional 40 million to the MLRP, and then released a second set of guidelines for public comment. And then finally, most recently, put out the solicitation for the second round of block grants. Again, the demand for the program well exceeded the existing program, existing funding. And just recently, the second round of block grant recipients was announced, and I will touch on that in a minute. So next slide. So this map shows you in yellow all of the regions that have applied for MLRP funding to date. So it's not just folks in the San Joaquin Valley. You know, SIGMA is and groundwater overdraft is an issue throughout the state. DOC has prioritized, at least in their early grants, that a big focus on the San Joaquin Valley. So you have the Tule Subbasin, Cahuilla Subbasin, and Madera County received block grants. Importantly, the Lower Salinas Valley, closer to the coast, was also selected. And just 2 weeks ago, the second round of block grant recipients were announced. Again, we have another coastal entity, Pajaro Valley, and then Westlands Water District, Merced, and East Turlock Groundwater Sustainability Agency. Next slide. I won't go into all of this, only just to demonstrate how important it is to show that there are clear partnerships, diverse partnerships of folks involved in these efforts on the ground. And these lists have expanded even since we created the slide deck. These were, I think, the list of partners when folks applied for the state funding. But DOC really values a diverse array of partnerships coming to the table. Next slide. And here I'll just point out, importantly, this is not an overly prescriptive program. DOC is really wanting to allow for creativity and innovation and really customized approaches. So we're going to see a variety of objectives included in plans, from Madera, really focused on improving community well reliability and buffer zones between communities and farmland, to the Tule Subbasin, really focused on restoring upland scrub habitat and multi-benefit groundwater recharge basins. Importantly, the statewide support entity, what we will be doing is making sure that the block grant recipients are well aware of a full array of options that exists, and to make sure that they are keeping their minds open about what's possible in terms of what can be implemented on the ground to match the needs of the local communities. Next slide. So I'll just touch on this because, while the MLRP is clearly focused on helping with the implementation of SGMA, this approach of multi-benefit land repurposing has value wherever this issue of increased water scarcity and agricultural water use is coming to a head, and where there's a projection that there's going to be a decrease in the agricultural footprint. And so we really think that there's the potential for this approach to have, a great application beyond the Central Valley. We've been in conversations with folks in Colorado and in New Mexico and Oregon, who are starting to think about how land repurposing can help them with this transition as well. And so I just want to touch on what EDF kind of sees as kind of the core tenets, the principles of what we think good land repurposing is. And the MLRP reflects a lot of this. The MLRP also gives a fair amount of discretion to the local entities implementing the program. So this is what we would consider kind of gold standard. So we want to see collaboratively developed programs, a lot of clear stakeholder engagement, involvement of the counties with the GSAs, with land trusts, and really getting these conversations going where we're considering all the factors that need to go into play as this land use change happens. We really want to see multi-benefit outcomes achieved. Again, this is not, we don't want to be singularly focused on converting the valley or any landscape to just solar, or even groundwater recharge for that matter. We really want to see a whole diversity of different benefits realized. There's a huge importance in regionally coordinated approach to maximize benefits. It's important to have bounds around a land repurposing kind of project area. And the groundwater sustainability agencies, groundwater basins, provide some clear boundaries that can be used. There's no reason why several GSAs couldn't work together and really maximize consolidation of land that can be repurposed to a whole variety of new uses. So we want to see more of that. Ideally, payments linked to benefits as opposed to just implementing projects. We want to make sure that actual outcomes are being achieved on the ground. Next slide. And really, we want to see a movement towards more permanent repurposing of these lands with, clearly an eye on creating flexibility for landowners as they go through this transition, but a recognition that this demand reduction needs to be happening on a long-term basis, and we need to be smart about how we are thinking about long-term the repurposing of these lands. And to that point, we want to see guaranteed demand reduction associated with these projects, as well as clear monitoring and adaptive management, so we know how to track what's happening on the ground, and how we're moving in terms of achieving the outcomes we want to see. Next slide. So this is my last slide. I'll just touch on kind of where EDF is going forward. We're clearly focused on, making the MLRP as successful as possible. A key part of that is making sure that we have secure and stable funding available. And I will just update on in terms of, we have 90 million for the MLRP right now. There was 20 million proposed in this year's budget at the state. It ended up being cut in the May revise and deferred to the climate bond. So we will be focusing on that. There is a proposal in the Senate's version of the bond, I think for 300 million for MLRP, and I think 100 million in the Assembly's version. All of that is very encouraging, but I will say to address this issue at the scale that we are expecting, this is going to require hundreds of millions of dollars and potentially even to the low billions. So still a drop in the bucket, so to speak. But I will also mention that there is the potential for federal funding. And just last week, Senator Padilla introduced legislation. It is titled the Voluntary Agricultural Land Repurposing Act, and it has set aside 200 million to not only be available to leverage the California MLRP program, but to really be available to address water scarcity issues more broadly than just groundwater. So the funding could be applied for land repurposing in California outside of the groundwater context. It could also be, the idea is to allow for pilot land repurposing programs to be established in other Western states facing similar challenges. So we're really encouraged by that movement. I will say the program is the legislation is very much modeled off of the MLRP, so it includes a lot of the principles of that program in terms of requiring clear collaboration and inclusive stakeholder engagement and delivery of benefits for ecosystems in disadvantaged communities and tribes. It's also critically important that we continue to get good demonstrations of projects on the ground. We need to make this as tangible as possible for landowners and make this real so that they know, what it is what we mean when we're talking about creating a wildlife-friendly recharge basin. So the more we can get those demonstrations on the ground and elevate success stories, I think the better off we're going to be. Again, we're really interested in replicating this approach outside of the Valley. And we need to be continuing to build broad support and a clear case for how this approach is another tool in the toolbox for the agricultural community to look to as they're dealing with this transition. And it's a way to help minimize the economic impacts to ag, but also create a whole array of new benefits for ecosystems and communities. And there's a really strong case to make that that should be beneficial to a wide array of stakeholders. So we're going to continue to focus on that. And I think with that might be the end.
Very good. Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Ellen. really great information there, and I can see the questions are popping in now. Probably don't need this, but just a reminder, if you have a question, to pop it into the written Q&A. And also you can thumbs up it to bring it up to the top of our list. And so with that, what I'd like to do is go ahead and get into the questions. I have a few of my own, but I want to get through the group's questions first. Excuse me. Both Suzanne Dahlman, right then I get a frog. Sorry about that. Suzanne Dahlman and Diane Wallace both have seen stories recently about groundwater reduction causing a change potentially in the Earth's rotation. And Diane asked, wouldn't oil extraction have the same issue? But since we're talking about groundwater today, and maybe, Ellen, this is a question for you, given the research that you've done. Do you have any comments on that? Any information that would support this theory that's out there?
So there was actually a story in the New York Times today about this, and it's based on some there's a body of research about some shifting in the Earth's rotation. That's been some irregularities in the Earth's rotation that have been especially noticed for the last 20 years or so, and some new research kind of adds to a bit of an explanation to what has already been looked at. The biggest factor seems to be melting glaciers, and then in terms of human caused things, and then the second one is land subsidence from groundwater pumping, and the research points particularly to a couple regions of the world. One is India, which has a lot of groundwater pumps, and one is the Central Valley. So one of the reasons we have Sigma now is because of that land sinking. So at least the good news is at least that we're on it. I guess I would say, in terms of trying to avoid more problems.
You just answered one of the questions I had, I think, because I was going to throw out that in the nation, we've got the Ogallala, we've got other aquifers that are struggling with the same kind of challenges, and I just wanted a sense of where California rates in comparison with the severity of the issues that we're trying to solve. Then I'll go to the next question. But if you guys could give us a sense of where's California compared to others in the nation, other groundwater basins.
You want to speak to that, Ellen? I mean,
well, I mean, we're not alone in having to manage our groundwater better. We were kind of behind the curve compared to some of the other Western states, but in some ways, I don't know. In some ways, we're more resourced in terms of ability to innovate and bring data to it and things. So I'm kind of optimistic about our trajectory. But Ogallala is a big one, and that's another place where the tools that we've been talking about in terms of thinking about how to repurpose some farmland are going to be key, because you cannot solve. There's a reason why you have long-term deficits of groundwater. It's because demand exceeds supply, and in ag areas that means that there's land that you could productively use the water for if you can pump it. So you kind of need pumping controls, and in California we do have the advantage of being able to kind of take advantage of some of these high flow events to add some water, but we're not going to be able to fill the whole gap, and that's going to be true in some of the other regions of the West that have these same issues.
And I would just say we're paying a lot of attention to the places that are not quite where we are yet, to try to prevent them. It's the stories and the visuals of land subsidence, wells going dry, communities having to truck water in. I mean, those stories are making it more into the headlines that have been to date, but there are places, in Eastern Oregon, I mean, Arizona, that they're not too far off from heading to where California was pre-Sigma. I mean, we're still having impacts on our groundwater basin as we speak, but at least we have a path towards sustainability charted out, but we've got plenty of places where it's not too late for intervention if we're really intentional and proactive about it.
And
Okay,
and I would just add there that, you know, the parts of California that in those maps about sort of which of the basins are critically overdrafted and which need to comply with SGMA but aren't critically overdrafted, most of those basins are, you know, in not bad shape. They have like some, you know, local issues and things. And so SGMA is a tool to prevent them from getting into too much trouble.
Thank you. And thanks for bringing it back to California. And that's what our next question from Jack Humphreyville is about. He wants to know how farmers are being compensated for the change in land use. So how is this working out for the farmers? And maybe you could talk about how are they receiving the program?
Well, so it's very early days in implementation of the program. Block grant, the first round of block grant recipients are really still kind of organizing themselves, making sure that they're bringing in community interests as their land repurposing plans are being developed. So now is the time to kind of be informing the vision for how they want land repurposing to be implemented in their particular boundary. I think I would say the receptivity to this concept of land repurposing has changed markedly. And I'm not going to say agriculture is a monolith, but my experience in working with agricultural partners has changed dramatically over the past, I would say 6-7 years, when there was not room for a dialogue around demand reduction. And how to even minimize, you know, the impacts associated with demand reduction, because as Ellen pointed out, there's been this hyper focus on getting as much supply into the valley as possible, and therefore we're not going to have to really feel the impacts. I think a reckoning, it has happened and it is continuing to happen about you know, an acceptance that there's going to be, you know, a fair amount of, you know, at least 10 to 15%, in some cases, maybe even more land that's going to have to go out of production. So that acceptance paired with the fact that now there's some state funding to help support the transition and the promise potentially of federal funding is bringing more folks to the table to learn more about it. We're definitely going to have the early adopters who are going to be really critical to demonstrating how, you know, these different strategies can work on the ground, and they're going to have to really be the ones, you know, the key messengers to the broader agricultural community about how this can work and how this can actually minimize impacts. So no payments have happened yet. There are lots of conversations about the types of land repurposing projects that are going to be most viable depending on the local context, which strategies might be most profitable, et cetera. So, and not everything needs to fall within the MLRP. There's certainly solar development that can happen outside of MLRP, although the program can help support some of that. But I think everyone's trying to figure out, and PPIC has been focusing on this a lot, how can we replace some of this lost revenue, you know, in as at least painful a way as possible. And so again, lots of room for creativity and innovation on that front. So I would say the conversations are promising right now.
Thank you, Anne. So more of a holistic approach, not necessarily individual farmers compensated, at least not now, and a lot of different potential repurposing purposes.
Yeah.
Diane Walls has a question about high water use crops. And I think there was a comment that you made, Ellen, about the types of crops that are more attractive in some of these scenarios for the future than others. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And you know, this is one of those complicated things, because one sort of if one's not a farmer, one can sort of look at just which crops are thirstier than others and think, well, why don't farmers just grow the stuff that's less thirsty? And you know, there is everything. Every summer crop and every tree crop in the valley needs irrigation, right? That's just why it's a great place to grow stuff, is because it's really sunny and it doesn't rain at inconvenient times. So, you know, irrigation, you can apply the water. That's why you have this sort of miracle of you know, incredible bounty of specialty crops in this part of the world. And we supply, you know, the nation and a lot of international markets with a lot of these products too. So, you know, within that, tomatoes use less water than almonds. Pistachios use a little bit less water than almonds. Alfalfa uses a lot. So farmers take that into account, but the water is just one piece of it. The market for the crop is the main piece that they have to consider, and what their soil conditions can handle. And so there's been a shift to more dollars per drop over time, where farmers have recognized the scarcity of water in the valley, and they've put it toward crops that are earning more dollars per acre foot of water applied. That happens to be almonds and pistachios and, you know, some veggies, but, you know, mostly the tree crops. So that's why you've seen this incredible shift. It used to be the case that there were, you know, lots and lots of acres of cotton. There's very little now because people have shifted over. So kind of regulating around what crops farmers should grow based on the water that they use is not the best way to second guess the business decisions. What really matters is making sure that farmers have their budget. And so that's what Sigma is really about, is sort of setting, okay, what's our groundwater budget and how much is sustainable? And if you don't have that water in your bank account, then you've got to go find it from somebody else, or you have to grow less and make your decisions about what crops you grow and how many acres you grow it on based on your business decisions, knowing how much water you've got. Does that help?
Yeah, no, I think that's very helpful.
Okay.
So thank you, Ellen. And I'm going to try to speed up our questions a little bit because we've got a lot of them here and a lot of good ones. Charming Evelyn asked about this recent article on Tulare Lake and how it's been drained repeatedly. And she's saying, since this area is exactly where the water is needed, how should DWR approach the reestablishment of the lake? A little bit aside from the topic, except for that you've got repurposing happening there and naturally, potentially. What do you think?
So could we go, Gary, could we go to slide 20? Because it'll be easiest to sort of see this with the map that I've got of where we expect fallowing to happen. Here we go. Okay, so the Tulare Lake Basin, you can see look on the map to the furthest to the right. The Tulare Lake Basin includes the old Tulare Lake, and what's shown in colors on these maps is irrigated cropland in 2018. So that's the actual irrigated footprint. It is an area that is farmed normally. I mean, so not this year because it's full of water, but it is not farmed with tree crops because it's got, most of that area is because it's got flooding potential and it's not got great soils for tree crops. It's clay. It was a lake because it was clay, and so it's not a place that's good for recharge. So in our modeling, if you have flexibility in full flexibility in water trading, the water would want to move away from use in Tulare Lake on things like safflower, and so there's some higher value veggies too, but it's annual crops, and a lot of it would want to move toward other places. Whether it's that's a business decision for the growers who are in that area, whether they would want to do that or not. And no matter what our model says, if they feel that they're doing fine with their ag operations, they're not going to change that. They're going to be getting probably some crop insurance right now for the flood damages. So they'll be made, maybe not completely whole, but somewhat. It's not going to be a great place for recharge. People are, imagining what would happen if we let the lake come back and be there forever. You have to remember that this is a really banner wet year, and it only floods now in really wet years, because most of the water is taken off those rivers in normal years well before it gets to the Tulare Lake. So I don't think it would require major changes in thinking about water management down there to restore it for the long term.
I would say, I think that there's a yes on all that. I also think that there's a lot of thinking going on right now about how to reduce flood risk during, in these times of extreme water, events, and what role can, restored floodplains have in that mix, as well as, I know some folks are thinking about it. Could there be some sort of intermittent wetland complex that could be there? But that, again, it all comes down, a lot of it's going to come down to the small number of very powerful landowners who are there, and their, calculations on what's going to make sense to them given any number of factors. So it's a very complicated issue that a lot of folks are thinking about right now, and there's a huge interest in let's bring it back forever, and it's just not that simple. Not that I'm implying that the person asking the question thinks that it's simple, but it is layers and layers of complexity in terms of how it's operated, water rights, land ownership, land value, all of that. So I'll leave it there.
But I think you helped answer Lauren Steely's question too, which is, does this change thinking about how things might be repurposed? And so it sounds like you guys are thinking about that and what that underlying land condition is and the opportunities there. So yep. I'm going to go on to Tony Wilkinson's question. I'm going to read it just to make sure I get this right. I realize the shock value of the NRDC slide that projected almost total destruction of irrigated ag in the San Joaquin Valley. However, they also emphasize sound water data. It would be helpful if the sound data on which the apocalypse was based could be shared. So I'm not sure about NRDC, Tony. Maybe you're thinking about the slide shown earlier, and could be Ellen's presentation. But think that unless this was something that was pre-Sigma. But Ellen, do you want to address?
Well, yeah, I mean, I can say. So all of the things that I've shown are all.
Oh, and I'm sorry, he corrected. It's EDF slide.
Okay.
I missed it, and it's to you.
But anyway, so Tony, the data for everything that I've shown is available in reports and appendices, and in the slides that we end up posting afterwards. I'll put links in there so that you can see it. But the estimates of fallowing. And I think Ann's showing our numbers basically. Yeah. So we're talking about the same thing.
Blame Ellen. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not, it's in the 10 to 20% range. It's not total destruction. Yeah. And it's far less proportional in terms of the economic damage, especially to the valley, especially if people are, if people can make sort of choices to put the water on the crops that are that contribute most to GDP and jobs.
Thank you. I'm going to go, Frank Colcord, excuse me. Frank has two questions here. One about how Southern California water agencies can support these types of programs, but maybe the more interesting question to respond to, if you could tie this in there, he's asking about whether either of you have an opinion on water management. I think I'd call it water rights legislation, because that's how it's mostly referred to right now across the state, that's being proposed, and list the series of bills, and whether water rights legislation would facilitate the transition to more sustainable groundwater basins.
I'll take a quick stab. That legislation is really mainly about managing surface water during droughts, and making sure that there is sort of the priorities are followed, that we're addressing domestic use needs that can be that are a priority in some places and aren't served during extreme droughts, water quality requirements, environmental flows, and all of that, and basically putting order into our kind of giving some teeth to the priority system for surface water rights that we have. I don't see it as a major impact on Sigma implementation, honestly.
I'd agree, and EDF hasn't taken any public positions on those bills.
Okay, thank you. I'm watching the clock. We only have a few minutes left. And what we'll try to do for those questions that aren't answered, we'll collect them and see if we can't circle back and get responses from our speakers to you all. So Gary, if you could please take note of the questions. Pierre, Pierre Swan is one of our steering committee members, and he has a little bit more of a statement, but he's saying that as an owner in the San Joaquin, they tried to develop a solar farm and couldn't get a connection to the grid, and expects that's a big problem. Also, that when land is valued, there needs to be there's a continued need to manage weeds, which left unmanaged spread of their seeds widely over actively farmed areas, like the concept in the Tulare Basin of using the lower parts of historic lakes as flood control and habitat. We need to help in increasing conveyance to move more water during the few wet years, and notes the canal capacity challenges. Either of you want to comment on this issue these issues that are being brought up by Pierre?
As usual, Pierre has insights, good insights on a lot of things. Hi, Pierre. The transmission capacity is going to be the #1 challenge for getting the amount of solar in the valley that the state projects that it needs to meet its clean energy goals and that people in the valley would like to do. And so you're seeing projects getting bigger and more expensive because of lack of transmission capacity, because they've got to build sort of connections more and so on. So yeah, that's a big challenge of state infrastructure planning.
And I would just say there's a lot of thinking going on right now as the MLRP is starting to be implemented, identifying these barriers that we are anticipating that are on the horizon or exist right now, and really start tackling them. So there's actually a really promising collaboration called the San Joaquin Valley Water Collaborative Action Program, or the CAP, which has over 70 members representing ag, water agencies, NGOs, community-based organizations, local government, and we're coming together on a whole array of water supply and land use issues, but the challenges around realizing some of these new ways of managing previously irrigated ag land is a top priority. And so I would just say the barriers to implementing solar is high on the list, the transmission issue. We're also talking a lot about, and he didn't even raise it, but I'll just raise it, the issue around landowner assurances associated with habitat restoration projects, that's critically important. Landowners have to have confidence that they're not going to be dinged for species coming onto their lands and then taking them. So there's a running list of things that we're trying to tackle as a collaborative, so that we can get out ahead as folks start to really want to implement these projects.
Well, I just want to say, I think that's a good place for us to stop. And I know many of us appreciate the work that you're doing to try to help be problem solvers and find ways to collaborate with these agencies and individual landowners that are struggling through this issue right now. There are models to help us on the Colorado River as well. So not as much in California, but for sure across the basin. And so what I'd like to do is thank both of our speakers for joining us today. Really appreciate the time. There's been a couple of questions in the chat. I think, Gary, if we have our last slide up, you'll see that our presentations are available on our website. It usually takes a little time to get them posted, but you will have both the video and the slides for those of you that go to the Southern California Water.org website. And we look forward to having everybody join us back again. I can't tell you what our July presentation will be because it just got changed, which means potentially we'll have a holiday in July. But we really look forward to having you join us the 4th Wednesday of the month And we'll notify everybody when we get a speakers or panel lined up for our next presentation. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Anne. It's good to see you.
Thank you.